Hi, I'm Dan Cunning. I've been a Rails contractor since 2008. Sorry, let me move on over. And under my company, Cunning Simplicity, Inc., don't be too impressed, it's just me. It just means I've been employed since 2008. And that's my stupid little picture that I use on websites all over the place and on topdan.com, which is my personal website that I just kind of write about stuff I like sports, movies, TV, and programming, which is, I guess, why we're all here today. So I've just been coming to the Ruby meetup since like middle of last year, maybe later last year, and just kind of thinking about what I could talk to you guys about, like what I could share in my whatever years in Rails, and kind of came up with this, growing your Ruby app. So kind of, let's go over here. So growing your app, like you normally think about building your app, right? But buildings get finished. Like your software is never finished, it's always growing. And if you're not careful, after 2 years, you're gonna end up with a vine, a mess, and when you really wanted a bonsai tree that's really nice and slick. So in my years, I've made some of the stuff on the right, some of the stuff on the left, and a lot of stuff kind of in the middle. So one of the biggest benefits of Rails is that it kind of gives you an organization. You have your model view controller, which is what we'll see here. So like the Rails architecture helps you grow in the right direction, helps you not make a vine mess of everything, but it doesn't give you everything you need to stop making a mess, which you'll know if you've seen any app after, call it 2 years, 3 years, maybe even 6 months, it'll be a mess. So this is kind of the basis of any web server-based web framework, is a request comes in and a response goes out. And Rails helps you out with the model view controller in there in the yellow. And the point there is, you might have learned in college, the model view controller is just separation of concerns. The model sits in front of the database, the controller grabs some information from the model, sends it to the view, and a response comes out. And so what I'm gonna kind of give you is a bunch of tips on how to keep each one of these pieces nice and like contained and less of a mess. Because if you're not careful, it will be a mess after 2 years. So the controller tip number 1 is to stick to the standard actions. So if you've touched any Rails app, those are the standard actions. It helps keep your controller small. A small controller is an easy controller to read. And an easy controller to read is a secure controller, hopefully, or it's less likely something's hiding in there. And just kind of a RESTful resource, like that's kind of a high-level thought, but let me give you some code that, let me make this bigger. Can you read that all right? So the very top is like a user's resource. So it's all the actions that you get when you do resources users. So the get actions, you're just getting information. But the important ones are post, maps to create, patch and put, maps to update, delete, maps to destroy. And you stick to those verbs, stick to that mapping. When you start throwing extra verbs at it, it just kind of gets messy and your controllers grow and you end up with a 200-line controller that no one wants. And down at the bottom is kind of some real-life examples that I've seen in projects over the years. So like the user's controller has a reset password action. Like if you spin that over a little bit, you can think of it as you're creating a password reset. And you're not copying a post, you're creating a copy of a post. And you're not reordering widgets, you're updating the order of widgets. So it's just kind of spinning like other verbs into create, update, delete, which is kind of what the basis of creating a RESTful API, a RESTful app. So that's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is pull your logic into services. And there's a million posts written about services. You can go and read plenty of them, but I'll give you my little 1-minute long summary of what a service is. So it's a plain old Ruby object that just does some stuff the computer or the controller doesn't care about. Like the controller cares about parameters coming in and the session coming in, and it sends out a render, a redirect, and maybe changes the session a little bit. But everything else you can pull into a service. And it just kind of keeps the controller thin and keeps the control flow of the controller simple. So I'll give you some code on that one. Oh, that's big. Sure.
I think of services as an object that acts upon your models, and it's a great design pattern.
Yeah, so this is one that probably doesn't need a service. It's just creating a user. It's a really simple flow. It's if it saves, do this. If it didn't save, do that. So that doesn't really need a service. But there's another one, call it creating a session or logging yourself in. Just kind of pulling, you can pull a lot of logic out of the controller into like a little helper object. So we send in the session params. So down here we got username and password. And you're just you just start asking it questions like, are the credentials valid? Is that user locked out? Does it need to reset a password, or can we just log them in and send them on their way? Each one has a question and then a response. So you can imagine what the code underneath would look like, but the controller doesn't care. It just needs to know what to do when these things exist. And what you were talking about, if you save and a save is successful, you want to like queue some background jobs or send some emails or do some stuff the controller doesn't care about. So you can wrap those into service objects as well. So the model tip number one is to treat your models like API documentation for your database. Just kind of what I was talking about with like the MVC framework. It's not exactly MVC. Like the M in MVC is a lot more complicated. You can add listeners and do a bunch of, like the request flow from a request to response is a little simpler in Rails. So the model layer is really just a nice way to get data out of the database and update the database. If you start doing all your other stuff in the model, it gets messy, your model gets really large, and you kind of lose a solid foundation because your models are like what makes a solid app. And kind of piggybacking on that one, use nouns and avoid verbs. Like if you're going to add something to your model, ask yourself if the database needs to be able to know how to do that. So a database knows what the username is because it's storing it, but it doesn't know how to unsubscribe a user. Unsubscribe it might need to send an email to an admin or something, or like literally sending a welcome email. Why does a model need to know how to do that? And publishing a post, there might be a lot of stuff. You might be updating an RSS feed, which doesn't really fit into the model. Let me give you kind of a user model example here. So just kind of, first off, just kind of the organization of this model. It's kind of what I talk about with like organizing it like an API. Like an API is a document you go to and it'll tell you how to use it. So this is just a very well organized modules at the top, enums, relationships, validations, scopes, and then your methods. And your methods are really small. And they're nouns. You're asking for a full name. You're not asking to unsubscribe or do something, because then it kind of gets out of control because your model could be doing anything. And your scopes are in alphabetical order, and I like just using one line of scope. If a scope's going to be multiple lines, you can do like what I did here, where you're just calling a method somewhere else. Like for your API documentation, you're just looking for, hey, I want to search. Search is available, great. If you want to know the details of it, you can go and find this function. Find that useful where in other projects you have your scopes all over the place. Like there's 5 modules that are all pulling together into this model, and when you're just kind of looking at how to sort for something, it might be in that file, it might be in this one. Like this way, it's all in this list. So I find that really useful. And then if you're avoiding verbs in your model, your jobs are just completely verbs. So all the stuff that I was talking about shouldn't be in your models before can be jobs like this. So like unsubscribe a user, send an email, publish a post, calculate a total. And kind of the nice side effect of this is that you get to actually tell it how to run. Like if you call user.send welcome email, does that use Sidekick? Does that use your background processor? You don't know. So if it most likely doesn't, and then that method call could error at any time because your mail server might be down or something. So here you're literally telling it, do this and do it now or do it later. Here. And job tip number 2 is to break your jobs into smaller jobs. So if you're sending 1,000 emails, they'll send quicker if you send them 10 at a time. So just loop through them and then perform it later and let Sidekick do its thing. And kind of a nice side effect of that is that you don't need to worry about things like restarting and exceptions. So like, say you have a 5-minute job and you want to restart or deploy your app, which involves restarting your background processor. What happens to that 5-minute process, right? And the answer is Sidekick will wait for it for a little bit, but it won't wait 5 minutes. It'll kill it, throw it back on the queue, restart itself, and then start it all over. And maybe you don't want it to start all the way over, right? And it's the same with exceptions. If something happens 4 minutes in, it'll try to restart it and run that 4 minutes of processing again. So if you can break it down to the smallest piece, it makes support a lot easier, and it makes kind of things less error prone. So the mailers tip number 1 kind of piggybacks off that. So never use deliver now. I've never seen a good reason why you should use deliver now, which means like you have this mail, you want to send it to the SMTP server right now. Like it's that important. But anything that wraps that it could just randomly fail because SMTP servers die. So anybody have any clue why this is such a bad idea? Looping through users and sending emails? It's blocking, and one of these deliver calls is eventually going to fail. So say you're sending 200 emails and it fails for this one guy, and you get an error report that this one guy's email didn't happen. You don't know who you actually sent emails to.
I disagree.
What do you think?
That was probably bad. I don't agree with that rule. But as far as times to use delivered now, let's say you have to record that it was delivered. Delivered now itself doesn't really give you that hook. You could dirty the separation of concerns by doing something in the mailer chain, but the easiest way is to use a service object that's already running as a background job and does the delivered now and then records it was delivered and then rescues from the exception and then records something appropriate for that exception that can be picked up. So that is a case where I would say use delivered now, not delivered later.
Gotcha. And that would be the smallest possible job you could separate it, right? So yeah, if you're recording whether or not something was successfully saved, sure, use it. But don't use it like this.
No, that's terrible.
Yeah, because your somebody's going to get a duplicate email out of this. Because if it errors halfway through, Sidekick will restart it, and everybody in that first half will get an email.
Or for debugging, you may want to just, on the Rails console, you're testing something out an email, just do deliver now yourself, rather than having to
True.
pick up a separate.
Yeah, in development. Yep.
Another time I've seen use it is I've seen applications that don't actually have a worker, don't even go as to why, and so sometimes you have to work around that.
That's living on the edge. Your requests are eventually going to 500, but go give it a go. So this is the second one. I like grouping my mailers together. So you see on the left, there's 3 mailer directories. On the right, they're all under the mailers, because the mailers are kind of connected. They probably live in the same layout. Just kind of, it feels better. And here's a little code on how to do that. Didn't quite fit, but just in your application mailer, set your template path to this, and by default, it's just that. You just underscore the name, but if you throw model mailers in front of it, then you're... It's literally one line. But yeah, I like the way that looks better than the way Rails default does. What's that? So views, avoid logic, like a lot of complicated logic in your views. Your views should be a bunch of HTML and some control flow, like you're looping over records, or you're if this, display this, if that, display that. But keep it really simple. The second you're using like real Ruby code, like long calls, lots of parameters, all this stuff, it gets messy, and like you kind of want your design guys to be able to read your views. They might not be editing it, but they can look at it. Just pull most logic into the helpers, and break your views down into visual pieces. So I just kind of put red blocks around it. So like top nav, side nav, footer. Those are all like nouns in the page, recent activity, product news. All those are like special pieces. If you can't break down your page like that, you might think about what your design is like, or how you want their eyes to flow on the page and whatnot. Like it should be able to break down in these little blocks, and then you can kind of make the layout kind of like this, where this is really simplification of it, but you're just calling helpers, and this is kind of what that WordPress page would look like. So the top nav, you're just showing the top nav and the side nav, they live on the body, and then you're grouping the other stuff into a container and yielding to the action. And like your whole app can live like this. It's really simple. The layout doesn't need to know what's involved with the top nav, all that stuff. So the action itself is pretty simple too. You're just doing a header, and then you're saying how the two boxes are arranged. You're not saying what those two boxes are, how they render, all that stuff. The helpers can do that. This view is just saying it's two boxes side by side. And this is kind of like bootstrap-ish CSS, but your actions are mainly just arranging components in the view. And the components themselves, we can handle how they are rendered later. If you do it all in one, the views get really long and really complicated. And helper tip number 1, break your helpers down into view components. View components are just more plain old Ruby objects that render something. So like that top nav, that sidebar, the footer. If they're decently complex, if there's a lot of like what to display, how to display it, pull it into a plain old Ruby object. Don't have it just in your view or in your helper like that. That's where 300-line helper files come from. And it also allows like OO design, like you can reuse it. Like if you come back to this, like the recent activity and product news, those are exactly the same, they just have different content. So in code-wise, here's a sample header or helper file. You're calling the recent activity, you're calling product news, and you're using the same view component. I call it posts box. So it's just a box full of posts. And each one's it's named differently and it has different posts in it, but it's essentially the same thing. It's the same HTML. So if you pull them out into a Ruby object, you can reuse it like that. And helper tip number 2, see if you guys enjoy this one, but I hate include all helpers. After 2 years, you have a ton of helpers. This view calls a helper there, and a helper there. And it just kind of makes a mess out of things. Like when one view is talking to its helpers, that's great. If it's talking to another person's helpers, you need to think about whether or not that should be like abstracted into like a shared library or some shared helper so that everything can use this kind of stuff. But if everything can access anything, that's where like that vine of trees happens from earlier, where you have to start just searching all over your app to see whether or not this helper's used when you're deleting stuff. And it also helps with the namespace. If you have 100 helpers, then some method names, did you use that method name already? Should you underscore your method name with your helper, like user everything in your user helper because you don't want your namespaces to conflict, that kind of thing. So this kind of eliminates all that, just turning off all helpers. If you're in view components, you can just kind of reuse the code there. Here's kind of the application architecture that comes from that. We added services and components and just kind of had a bunch of tips on keeping the models simple without a whole lot of business logic in it. Your models are your business data. Your jobs are your business logic for the most part. And your service objects are just there to support your controller code. All the stuff that doesn't deal with parameters or sessions or redirects or renders, that can get pulled into something not the controller and expose it in a way the controller can stay really nice looking. And the views can be mostly just HTML. What do you got?
So Rails has a convention for where to put your controllers, models, and views. When you introduce services and view components, what are your recommendations for how to organize those?
Sure. You can create another app/services, and in your application file, you can just add that to the list. It's like auto-load paths.
And what about the view components? Do those go under services as well?
I'd put them under view components. Like services are for controllers, view components can be another one. And that's, yeah, like that's,
You can make as many as you want. I've had projects that had several custom
Yeah.
models for it was fine.
yeah. A common one if you ever use Pundit, which is an authorization gem. So like, say the user controller is running create, and you want to know whether or not the current controller or current user can create a user. Pundit kind of creates this notion of policies. So there's a user policy that answers the question create. So like that's another little piece that every app that I make has authentication or authorization pieces. And I use another one for like integrations. So I have like they're basically jobs, but I have them called integrations. So it's all the sites that I interact with. So if I'm posting to Twitter, there's a Twitter / thing. So like it's all just there on what my application interacts with. So it's just a good way to like organize stuff. And kind of definitely Rails doesn't give you all the tools to not make a mess. So when you think about things in architecture like this, organize things that way. So if these things are service objects, they help the controllers, put them all in their own directory. The view components are just visual elements for the most part. So keep them in their own directory. And that's kind of my main point, is plan your Rails architecture, because it's not going to answer every question you have. Set the convention. The Rails convention gets you a good bit of the way there, but you need more. And don't compromise on that convention. If you're going to compromise, go back and change the convention. Don't just forget about it, because the broken windows theory is true, which means if you're looking at a bunch of windows and one's broken, it's more likely that another one gets broken, because they've already compromised a little bit, and then the third one's even easier to break, and then 2 years later, everything's broken. And so all that tries to keep your greenfield project feeling like a greenfield project, and keep you from loathing going into a code base 2 years later. So just kind of sum it up, like think about the bonsai tree and like how much it takes that guy to like cut it back every day, or like all the care to keep it looking nice. So even if you don't like kind of some of my recommendations, you should think in terms of like, how can you keep your app looking nice? And it kind of boils down in my head of keeping your models simple, your controllers simple, and your views simple, because that is the basis of the MVC framework. And that's my stupid picture again. So, any questions?
This video has been sponsored by Rieta Incorporated. Learn more today at rietta.com.